Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. Well, we're in part 2 of our story tonight, and we've realised that Prudence is up in the attic looking around for stuff with her dogs at the bottom of the ladder. But we go back to her childhood where she'd had a ghostly encounter with a woman that she saw around the gravestones at the bottom of the school playgrounds. And so, of course, this is an incredibly interesting story, and we're about to find out where it's going to lead. And let's get started with part 2 of our story tonight. Certainly, Prudence's great-grandfather Corey, who lived to the grand old age of 104, had not been afraid to tell his ghost story at every family gathering and dinner party, where the guests, with wide-open eyes that almost popped off their faces like a teddy bear's buttons, would shake their heads and say, "Never! Oh, my word! That is too dreadful for words! You're saying you saw these 3 ghostly apparitions yourself? How absolutely terrifying! How old were you when this happened, Corey?" Corey would recount his tale, thoroughly enjoying the attention he derived from all the guests, as no one at the dinner table would even rattle the cutlery or tinkle with a glass, as they listened with bated breath as her great-grandfather Corey told his bewildering tale. No wonder Prudence's mother had developed such an aversion to old houses, given what Corey had to tell everybody. "Well, when I was a little boy, I was about 8 years old at the time. I lived in a very old house that rattled throughout the day or night. Some of the stonework in that house was imported from France, you know. It had a long history attached to it. It was one of those houses that made me feel incredibly uneasy. There were always strange, obtrusive noises that could be heard, that made no sense to me at all. I would often hear the sound of a cast-iron frying pan literally be walloping against the kitchen wall and falling to the ground with a mighty thunderous crash. But whenever you entered the kitchen, it was all but silent. Sometimes I would hear the pitter-patter of tiny little feet running up and down the stairwell, and then the giggle of a little girl. Doors would sometimes slam behind themselves loudly. Items would mysteriously be moved, found in the most odd places. In my bedroom, my mother always complained that I was always shifting this chair, when I was doing nothing of the kind. I think my parents conveniently turned a blind eye to it all. They didn't want to believe that anything unnatural was going on. I bet your bottom dollar they probably found a plausible explanation for every sound they heard. But I was incredibly uncomfortable living in that house. I was certain that something was clandestinely watching me, something that I couldn't physically see. Although, of course, there were occasions in my peripheral vision I would see the flash of a dark shadow, and when I turned around, nothing was ever there. When I told my mother about my trepidation concerning the house we lived in, she told me, "Oh, don't be silly, Corey. Old houses make noises. Everybody knows that. You've just got a wild imagination, that's all." I was in bed one night, fast asleep, only to awaken with absolute horror when I observed 3 menacingly ambiguous, vague, dark, shadowy, hooded figures standing over my bed, about 2 feet away, and that was far too close for comfort. It was almost as if they were examining me, as if I was some kind of specimen in a laboratory experiment. I remember it so vividly, as if it happened yesterday. I could see their faces were buried behind these hoods, but they were glaring at me through malevolent, dark, hollow eyes that glowed red in the dark. It was like something out of your darkest, most insidious nightmares. There was something profoundly demonic about these beings. I sensed they were incredibly evil, and that their intentions towards me were not remotely good. It was almost as if they physically wanted to harm me in some way. I jumped up in terror from my bed when I felt something talking directly into my ear. I felt that tickle you experience when someone is whispering to you. I heard a disembodied voice ringing like a static voice on the radio. "We've got you now. There is no escape. We want you dead." I was so terrified when I saw these menacing entities. I was certain they intended to harm me. I screamed the house down, and believe me, I screamed. My parents came bolting into my bedroom so fast. But of course, once they appeared in my room, the beings were gone very conveniently, like a flash of lightning. They just vanished before my eyes. But the funny thing was that even though they were physically gone, I knew they were still there, and that in itself was very discombobulating for a little boy like myself. I had no idea what these entities wanted with me, but they'd made it clear they wanted me dead. They were focused on me in some way, and that petrified the bejesus out of me. I was very scared of the dark, not unlike other children of my impressionable age. My parents told me I was imagining all this stuff, that it was all created in my head, and that there were no such things as ghosts. When I told my mother about the dark hooded figures with the red eyes that wanted me dead, she laughed and said, "Don't be so ridiculous, Corey. You're making all this stuff up. I know what this is all about. You don't want to sleep alone in your bedroom. But you're a big boy now, Corey. You can't expect to share our bed at your age. You need to learn to sleep in the dark." For the next couple of nights, the same thing happened to me. But it was getting significantly worse. The beings were moving closer and closer. They were no longer 2 feet away, but now inches away from my bed. My mother told me she would prove it was all in my imagination, so she liberally scattered talcum powder all over my bedroom floor, so there was powder everywhere spread over the dark wood. "I'm doing all this for you, Corey, to get my point across to you, that nothing and no one is visiting you during the night," she said very confidently. "Then you will see you're making this all up in your head." I knew I wasn't. I'd seen in the movies that they used crosses to ward off evil entities, so I instinctively took the family cross off the wall, in the hall, without my parents' knowledge, and I went to bed with it, clutching it closely to my chest. I was incredibly frustrated that my parents failed to believe my account. They thought I was imagining all this stuff, but I absolutely knew that I was not. My parents refused to let me share a bed with them, as I naturally didn't want to sleep in my room. And I suspect they thought I'd made the ghost story up as an excuse to share a bed with them because I was scared of the dark. But nothing could have been further from the truth. I actually enjoyed having my own bedroom, but not one that was being visited by these insidiously evil, idiosyncratic entities. My parents were very strict, religious people, with a no-nonsense, old-fashioned approach to child-rearing. So I was doomed to staying in that bedroom all on my own, and so every night I went to bed weighed down with that sense of impending dread. Once again the 3 hooded figures gathered around my bed that night, and I held up the cross towards them, and nothing prepared me for how these demonical beings would react to that cross. They growled, hissed, and snarled like rabid dogs. My whole bed just shook so violently, I thought I was going to be thrown off it, but I continued to defiantly hold the cross up towards them. I was overcome with an incongruous brave courage that surprised even me, for those ghostly entities shrank away into the shadows as though cowering in fear, and I was so relieved. I had a very good sleep that night, clutching the cross tightly to my chest. The following morning my confounded mother found 3 visible pairs of cloven-hooved imprints, all distinctly unique in their own right, which highlighted that 3 entities had indeed visited me during the night. But what? That was the question. The imprints were very large, like what you might find from a cow in the talcum powder. My mother realized my story about the 3 ghostly entities had not been remotely fabricated, and the fact that the imprints in the grounds were hooved, well, that scared her a great deal. "Oh, Corey, you poor thing! What you've been going through every night! And to think that I never believed a word of what you were telling me! But there is no doubt something has been visiting you during the night, and I think it's demonic. I'm going to have to call the pastor." When I told her that the beings had growled at me when I held up the cross at them, my mother's alarm increased exponentially. She immediately called our family pastor over to the house to bless it. She was in a blind panic when she began to comprehend what was actually going on. My mother told me years later that the pastor had sensed that there were 3 demonic presences in our house, and after an utterance of prayers and holy water being sprinkled liberally around the entire house, along with some incense being burned, they literally smoked out the demonic entities. The pastor blessed my room last of all, and that was where all the demonic entities were imprisoned. That was when he opened the window. Latin was being spewed, along with all kinds of growls and hisses. But the pastor stoically held his own, demanding the demons to leave through the window. My mother was shaking like a leaf, as something had grabbed her violently by the throat, and she screamed. But the pastor demanded that the demonic entity leave her alone. After a tumultuous time, the 3 demons my mother physically saw leave. They were like 3 black masses that were growling at the pastor, but eventually they disappeared through the open window of my room, and they were gone in just a wave of smoke. After the house blessing, the whole house became so much lighter and brighter. My parents, who at one stage had forever been arguing, never quarrelled again. They hadn't even realized how heavy and dark the foreboding atmosphere of the house actually was, until the oppressive feeling abated, and thankfully it never ever came back. The pastor believed one of the previous residents of our home had been dappling with black magic, and had invited those demons into the property. They even found a pentagram had been carved in the wooden floor of my closet, which my mother had never even noticed before. After those entities were gone, I still heard the child's laughter, the pitter-patter of little feet going up the stairwell. But that was a benign, happy energy that never bothered us, but the clanging, crashing sounds of the past were never heard in the house again. Prudence, aware of her grandfather's story, believed emphatically that there were more things on heaven and earth than could ever be explained, which was one of the reasons she had decided she'd never live in an old house. She could never have predicted falling hopelessly in love with the rather unorthodox Kyle Galloway, a man who loved all things old, and was so passionate about antiques and old vintage cars. If that were not bad enough, he had persuaded Prudence to leave their modern, fully furnished apartment in Queens and move 5 hours away to live in his grandfather's old 18th century farmhouse near the Finger Lake National Park. She had not had the heart to tell her husband Carl that this was the last thing in the entire world that she wanted to do. She was a city girl whom didn't like the idea of living in a remote farmhouse, and an old one at that. Oakwood Rise was swaddled by the lush, verdant countryside, upholstered richly by groves of lofty trees. It was far away from coffee shops and restaurants. She was certain she'd die of boredom in a lonely, forsaken place like this. The first time Prudence had laid eyes on Oakwood Rise, she had squirmed inside. She didn't like old houses. They intimidated her, thanks to her mother's impassioned influences that had made her almost shun anything old, except, of course, the old school building that she had frequented as a young girl, that she had grown to love.
"So what do you think, Cupcake?"
Carl had said to her. He took her hand merrily in his, and proudly led her around his grandfather's property, the cheery smile in his face so wide that Prudence was surprised it even fit on his face. She had never seen her husband look this gleeful before, almost as if he'd won millions on the state lottery. She liked to see him animated. Of course she did. She just wished with all her heart he wasn't so tickled pink about the thought of living in this old, rustic, 18th century double-story farmhouse. Why had Kyle's grandfather chosen to give it to him, while he was still alive, for goodness sake? She had been so content, so incredibly happy, living in their practical contemporary apartment in Queens. And this is where she thought they'd stay indefinitely, until they had enough money to move to a larger place. She had adored the convenient handiness of the location, a stone's throw away from her parents' glass and steel property. They were close to an idyllic park, to coffee shops and restaurants, but this isolated place was in the middle of nowhere. Granted, it was spectacularly beautiful. She would concede that. She appreciated the refined, expert craftsmanship, the distressed wood and exposed brickwork of the property, along with the complimentary, magnanimously large interior living spaces, not to mention the high ceilings, sprawling polished wooden floors, exquisite open fireplaces that serenaded every single room in the house, to guarantee toes and hands would remain toasty warm in winter. Then there was the stunning wooden staircase, with its ribbon of Persian carpet that elegantly cushioned each step, with a plump woolen buoyancy. She couldn't deny that it was all aesthetically very pleasing on the eye. Oakwood Rise's exterior boasted a stunning asymmetrical symmetry. Red exposed bricks, a front gable, a central chimney, large sash windows, a wraparound porch. There was absolutely no doubt most people would be over the moon to live in a place like this, but all that Prudence felt was a hesitant reluctance. Her hand felt wet and clammy in her husband's strong and certain grip. He squeezed it tightly, looking at her in abject delight.
I know. You're lost for words, aren't you, Prude, love? Don't worry, Cupcake. That's a normal reaction to have. I can't blame you. The place is absolutely spectacular, and these views are to die for. I loved coming here as a boy, you know. So many wistful, nostalgic memories I have. Incredibly special times that I spent with my grandfather. We'd go fishing by the creek in the woods. I was endlessly climbing those trees in the wood grove. Some of them are pretty ancient. To think Pop says this place is mine now. Do you realize what this means, Prudence? He said, throwing a few triumphant punches into the air with his fists, with an impulsive, spirited enthusiasm. This means we can live here forever, raise our children here. Isn't it wonderful news? Could you think of a better place for us to live and to raise a family?
But isn't it a bit far from New York? Said Prudence apprehensively. I mean, it's 5.5 hours away in a car. That means over 11 hours from New York and back. That's insanely ridiculous. It would never ever work for us, she said, squeezing her eyes tightly, silently begging that her husband would see that living here was a very bad idea indeed, and was not remotely practical for the both of them.
Oh, don't worry about that. Things these days are a lot more malleable in the workplace, you know. I'll work from the office at Oakwood Rise and commute a couple of days a week to New York. It's not a big deal, you know.
5.5 hours is not a big deal. I beg to differ. I'm sorry, Kyle. That's crazy. It is a big deal. It means 11 hours of your day is spent travelling. That's not practical. You'll be absolutely exhausted.
Not if I fly, I won't, said her husband, squeezing her hand tightly. "Flying will cut down my travel exponentially. Isn't this place wonderful?" "Fair enough, if that's what you really want. But I still don't feel convinced that it's a good idea. I need to ask you, Kyle, has anybody died on this property?" said Prudence, looking at her husband nervously through frightened brown eyes that wantonly gave her anxiety away. Kyle gave his wife a strange, curious look, and then cracked up laughing, amused by his wife's concern. "Honestly, Cupcake, you do ask curious questions. I have no idea if anyone died here. It's an 1800 farmhouse, for goodness sake. It's a distinct possibility. I'd have to look into the history of the home to find out those details for you. But whether someone died here or not should not be a concern to you. Let's not kid. Back in the day, lots of people died at home, did they not? Of all manner of diseases, from whooping cough, cholera, smallpox, dysentery, and even childbirth. They didn't have the medicines that we have today, so people had large families. Death in the home, even among the young, was not that uncommon. So there is a strong chance that someone may have indeed died here. But does that really matter? Why does that bother you so very much?" Prudence physically began to squirm, her stomach twisting in a tangle of tight knots. "Do you think the place could be haunted?" she asked bleakly. "My mother believes old houses have ghosts. She says we might not physically see them, but they're actually there. And if they're attached to a place, they won't leave. My mother's sensitive to these things, you know." "Is that why she lives in that god-awful goldfish bowl of hers?" laughed Kyle. "Because it's brand new. When it was created, no one else had lived there before apart from your family. Huh, that explains a lot to me. I can't believe you grew up in a glass house like that as a girl. You had absolutely no privacy. It was insane. Don't be ridiculous, Prudence. There is no ghost in this house. And even if there is, which is debatable, why would that ghost hang around here? Don't you think if you were a ghost, there's infinitely more interesting things you could be doing with your time, like exploring the Milky Way, or going off to watch an interesting show in Las Vegas? Why would you want to hang around here? It would be awfully boring, don't you think? If you must know, Cupcake, I stayed here a great deal as a boy. I think if this place was haunted, I'd be the first person to know about it, don't you? When I was a boy, I was very scared of the dark, and I don't say that lightly. I was more scared than most, and terrified that there were monsters lurking under my bed. Yet I never had trouble in sleeping in that room of mine upstairs. On the contrary, I felt a great deal safer here in this farmhouse than living at home with my parents in their apartment in Manhattan. I was always glad to escape the Big Apple, let me tell you. It was good to get away from the booming city, come to such a peaceful sanctuary such as this, and never once did I ever feel unsettled here. And that's saying a lot. Contrary to what you may believe, Prudence, just because a house is old does not mean it's haunted.
"But you are saying that someone could have died here, and I don't like the sound of that," said Prudence, sounding rather flat.
Honestly, Prudence, what's going on with you? If someone died here, is it really such a big deal?
"I suppose not," said Prudence, "as long as there's no dead people haunting this place. Unless, of course, it's the ghost I saw in the schoolyard when I was a girl. I liked that woman. If she haunted this property, I wouldn't mind a bit."
"You are incorrigible, Cupcake,"
said Kyle, giving her a big fat kiss on the cheeks that was as slobbery as a wet dog. Prudence wiped the spittle away, grimly. Kyle wasn't taking her remotely seriously, which was a tad annoying. He really didn't believe in things that go bump in the night. But he was clueless because he had never seen a ghost, so of course he was going to ridicule stuff he didn't understand or appreciate. The move to Oakwood Rise had been easy enough.
It certainly helped that Kyle's grandparents had excellent taste. The house was fully furnished with spectacular antiques. If you liked timeless classics, you'd have been in your element, living here. But for Prudence, living in an old house like Oakwood Rise was going to take a great deal of adjustment for her. Prudence didn't know anything about antiques. She was well acquainted to modern furnishings, so getting acclimatized to illustrious antiques was a work in progress for her. But then again, swanky avant-garde furniture would look completely incongruous and out of place in this old classic-style farmhouse, rather like a Komodo dragon might look, standing on the streets of New York, gawking at the passing traffic and wondering why all the potential food sources moving along on rubber wheels were made of very unpalatable aluminium carcasses.
"You've moved into an old house, have you?" said Mrs. McIntyre, sounding completely aghast. "You never told me this, Prudence. Why have you been so secretive about this? How dreadful! You poor thing," she had said, dipping her words into a saccharine sympathy. "What is wrong with that husband of yours? He seems to have such a fixation on all things antique. He better be careful. He might become one himself," she teased. "It's quite unusual for a man of his young age, don't you think, to be so interested in prehistoric fossils from the past? I mean, I loved your fully furnished modern apartment here in Queens that you were renting. Such a lovely place it was. You were only down the road from us. It was all terribly convenient. It's going to be so miserable for me, your being far away from the family, Prudence. Almost 5 hours away by car. 11 hours both ways. A ridiculously long drive, Prudence, love. Why doesn't Kyle bring that farmhouse to the ground? Throw a wrecking ball at the place. Build a modern replacement. It would be so much better, don't you think? I could put him in touch with some very current architects that could build you your dream place."
"He doesn't want to destroy Oakwood Rise, Mum. He loves the place. He came here as a boy. You know what Kyle's like. He loves all things old. At the moment, would you believe he's spending his spare time in the garage, working on an old vintage car, bringing it up to speed. He wants to show it off at a vintage fair. It's an old Cadillac. The interior of this thing is quite magnificent, actually, with all the superb wood on the dashboard. Even I have to admit that."
"Well, I've never been into old cars, love. Not my kind of thing. Give me a shining Jaguar any day of the week, and I'll be as happy as a pig in muck. But back to Oakwood Rise, my dear. How do you feel about it, given it's so old? I can't imagine. You poor thing. If I were wearing your boots, I'd be having kittens. Thank God your father was always on board with only living in houses we built ourselves from scratch."
"Don't get me wrong, Mum, I'm not complaining. Oakwood Rise is absolutely beautiful," I said, coming to my husband's immediate defence. "I mean, I can't find fault with it. It's just that I'm so used to modern houses. Most people would be chuffed to live in a house like this. But it's old, Mum. The staircases creak. When you open the downstairs tap, it makes a juddering, groaning sound. The house makes all these funny noises during the night. But Kyle says it's perfectly normal for an old house to make noises. He thinks it's part of the charm. But they kind of scare me, Mum, if you know what I mean. Maybe I'll get used to it in time, but at the moment it requires all manner of adjustments, and I feel ever so slightly unsettled."
"Oh, you poor thing. Oh, that sounds so ghastly, love. Too ghastly for words. I don't know what to say. You poor thing. You have my deepest sympathy. You must feel like you're living back in the dark ages, especially after growing up with us in such a modern masterpiece designed by such an up-and-coming architect. Do you think your place is haunted?" she said, dropping her voice to almost a silent whisper. "I bet it is. Old places always are, love. Believe me, I know. I can sense these things. Has anybody died in the property, do you know? You need to find out by checking out the history. Maybe you could call a shaman or a psychic.
to take a look at the property, read the energy for you. It's not a bad idea, love. At the very least, you'll get someone to bless the place for you. It'll make you sleep more soundly at night. Kyle doesn't know if anybody died here. He thinks it's a possibility given the house goes back to the 18th century, and a lot more people died back in the day. Well, there you go, love. You have your answer. It's got to be haunted. Sometimes the ghosts don't even know they're dead, love. And that's the problem. Imagine you go about your business. You could be being watched by unseen eyes. The thought gives me the heebie-jeebies. Imagine you're naked in your bathtub. You're being watched by a perv from the other side. The thought of it, dear. There are no words. Don't say that, Mum. I'm the one that has to live here, not you. I don't need my imagination being fattened up more than it already is. My imagination is obese. And if I don't put it on a diet, it's going to get seriously out of hand. I don't want to be showering with all my clothes on, do I? Just in case I'm being watched. It seems to me, love, you're going to have to start liking old things, or your life is going to be pretty bleak. I'm sorry, but it needs to be said, love. I will remind you, you married Kyle. You chose him. You knew when you married him he was a little on the eccentric side, didn't you? Now, your last boyfriend, his name was Eric Menenges. I liked him a great deal. Very personable he was. So trendy. He sported the most up-and-coming designer clothes when the two of you were dating. I never understood why you ended up breaking up with him. You know where he lives now, love? In one of the most cutting-edge houses in these parts, that he designed himself. That man is not short of a bob or two. Highly in demand he is. They say he's rolling in it, like a pig in clover. Sadly for you, love, that ship's gone by in the night. He's married an internet influencer who's got over 3 million followers. Can you believe that? I've seen her myself in town. Frankly, I don't know what on earth the fuss is all about. In real life, she's really quite dowdy, you know. Not desperately impressive, as she appears on screen. It's amazing how different people are in real life, isn't it? Everyone wants to be her, although goodness knows why. And to know exactly what she ate for breakfast, that kind of thing. And I think about what could have been, my love. He was really in love with you, you know. You could be living in his incredible house, a stone's throw away from me and your dad. He's a very successful architect, you know. Mum, I didn't love Eric Menenges. Liking him was a big problem. He was an egomaniac, full of himself. I'm not surprised he's married an internet influencer, someone as trendy as himself. Good luck to him, Mum. Kyle, Mum, has won my heart. I struck gold when I met him. I couldn't be happier. Well, that's a relief, isn't it, then? But there is one problem, love. When you marry someone, you marry their family. You marry their tastes, their styles, their likes and dislikes. So the way I see it, if you don't start loving Oakwood Rise, you're stacking up for yourself a whole heap of problems in the future. You need to have interests in common for a relationship to actually work. I guess I'm just used to modern stuff, Mum, having grown up in a goldfish bowl, said Prudence. But I'll have you know, me and Kyle have a lot in common. You're describing my house as a goldfish bowl? Now that's not kind, love. That's what Kyle's description of your house is, Mum, not mine. And it's kind of true if you think about it. I mean, I always felt we were on display for the whole world to see in that house. I'm sorry, but I did. Now that's very rude, love, very rude. That is a very, very rude thing to say. I'm quite offended, actually. Kyle wasn't being mean, Mum. You know what he's like. He's never made a secret of the fact that he hates your house. That's my point exactly, love. I rest my argument. He's a completely different taste to you and me, love. It might impose a problem for you in the future later down the line. That's all I'm saying. You're a city girl through and through, aren't you? How on earth are you going to adapt to life in the countryside? I couldn't do it myself. Every time you enter the house, you have to wipe the mud off your shoes. Oh, I hate the very idea of it. Your sister could never ever live, neither of them could live in the country. Our family is simply not cut out for a life like that. We like to be close to all the modern conveniences and amenities, don't we? We enjoy shopping, meeting up for coffee, that sort of thing." When Prudence stopped to reflect over her mother's troubling words, she realized one thing, that she really didn't know what her own individualist tastes actually were. She had adopted her mother's views over everything, and not formed her own opinions over things. She had grown up in an ultra-modern dwelling, and had not known the alternative. Certainly her mother's disapproval of all things antique had galvanized her in a similar prejudicial loathing. Yet she'd fallen in love with a man the antithesis of all things avant-garde and non-traditional. She loved her husband's outlandish eccentricities, his classic style. So maybe she was beginning to discover another side of herself that she never actually knew existed until now. There was no doubt that after moving into the charmed house, the place was slowly, magically worming its way into her heart. She never anticipated that happening, but the house appeared to be growing on her in leaps and bounds, with the same congenial warmth she had experienced around the time-worn gravestones on the school property when she was a little girl. Maybe she liked old stuff more than she cared to admit. Had she been in denial all this time? Furthermore, the couple's move to the farmhouse had gone pretty seamlessly, as if this new transition in their lives was actually meant to be. And Prudence was a very big believer in serendipity. In her experience, things would go badly awry when fate was pointing you to take another fork in the road, and none of that had happened moving here to Oakwood Rise. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.